Honorable members, the prayer. Lord, the God of righteousness and truth, grant to our Queen and her government, to members of the Legislative Assembly, and to all in positions of responsibility, the guidance of your Spirit. May they never lead the province wrongly through love of power, desire to please, or unworthy ideals, but laying aside all private interests and prejudices, keep in mind their responsibility to seek and improve the condition of all. Amen. Or is anybody? I see the Deputy Government House Leader.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. Thanks for acknowledging me. I rise to ask for unanimous consent for 1-minute bells for the entire morning sitting, including the first bell in Committee of the Whole.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I will ask this question only once. If there is anyone who is not willing to provide unanimous consent, please let yourself be known now. Hearing none, unanimous consent is granted.
Committee of the Whole.
Thank you, honourable members. I would like to call the committee to order. The Committee of the Whole has under consideration Bill 79 Trails Act. Are there any comments or questions to be offered with respect to this bill? For everyone's benefit, we are on Amendment A2. I see the honourable member for Edmonton Goldbar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to rise and respond to some of the comments that the Minister of the Environment made with regard to what it is the season of giving, and I certainly hope that whoever's cell phone went off will be generous with his or her donations to the charity of his or her choice. I do want to respond to some of the things that the Minister of the Environment said in response to the amendment that I proposed. First of all, let me just express my profound disappointment that the Minister of Environment is clearly not interested in having a good faith debate. That was quite clear from the comments that he made with respect to my character, the character of the official opposition. He certainly made a whole bunch of assertions that weren't true about the kind of people we are or our intent with respect to bringing forward these amendments. But what is most concerning is that I think that he was too quick to write off the amendments that we were proposing. I mean, the only refutation, if you could call it that he provided was that this amendment that we brought forward was going to be the equivalent of the Bill C-69, that if we passed this amendment that there would be no more trails constructed or operated in the province of Alberta. And unfortunately, not only is that not true, but I think he's too quick to dismiss the concerns of many Albertans who have looked at the Trails Act and said that they are concerned that there is no process for consultation, there's no process for environmental assessment of trails, and they're very unhappy with the process of land use planning. Now, going over the comments from the minister that he made in response, trying to separate out the vitriol and bombast from the actual substance of the debate was a very difficult task. But the best that I could come up with, Mr. Chair, was that the minister intends for the land use planning process to fill the hole that's fill the gap that's created by the passage of this Trails Act with respect to public consultation and environmental assessment when it comes to the creation and operation of trails. And the people of Alberta, I think, believe strongly in the process of land use planning. The only problem is that this government has not moved an inch on land use planning. We know that there are only 2 completed land use plans, the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan and the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan. The process, if you look on the Environment Department's website for the North Saskatchewan Regional Plan, has been started, but nobody seems to know what, if any, kind of progress has been made. The minister also referred to the creation of sub-regional plans through the land use planning process. Well, as far as I know, Mr. Chair, there's only one sub-regional plan in place, and that's the Livingston Porcupine sub-regional plan. And it's been this minister's involvement with changes to that plan that have caused concern for so many people who are interested in the Trails Act, right? We had a process in place for bringing all of the stakeholders together to come up with a sustainable way of promoting recreation on the landscape in the Livingston Porcupine region. And the minister threw a monkey wrench into that whole process and has essentially set that process back. And it certainly appears to many of the people who have been involved with that process that he intends to favor one group of recreational users over many others. And I think many of the other people who don't appear to have the favor of the Minister of the Environment are quite upset with how that process is playing out. So it's not correct to say that land use planning will address all of these concerns that are trying to be addressed through the amendment that I brought forward. The minister, as I said, is not making any progress on land use plans, and the land use plans that are in place have been stalled or set back intentionally by the actions of this minister. So I would just urge all government members today to understand that the consultation, environmental assessment requirements that are contained in this amendment are fundamental to making the Trails Act a successful piece of legislation. And need to be in there because the land use planning process is not far enough down the track to provide the protections that the people of Alberta are looking for. So with that, Mr. Chair, I will conclude my remarks and urge all members of the Assembly to listen to what the people of Alberta are saying, pass this amendment and create a comprehensive consultation and environmental assessment process that is sorely needed in the creation and operation of trails. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Are there any members wishing to join debate on A1? Sorry, A2. Seeing none. On Amendment A2, as proposed by the Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar, are you agreed? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Please say no. No. That amendment is defeated. We are back on the main bill, Bill 79. Are there any honourable members looking to join on Bill 79? I see the honourable member for Edmonton Gold Bar has risen.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, it is the Christmas season. I think we have plenty of opportunities to listen to bells outside of the House. We don't need to listen to them inside the House. I rise to propose another amendment to this piece of legislation.
Do you want to? you, honourable members. There will be copies of this amendment at the tables close to the entrances. If you raise your hand, one will be delivered to you as well. For everybody's benefit, this will be Amendment A3. If the honourable member for Edmonton Goldbar could please read it into the record and then continue with any comments should he so choose.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I move that Bill 79, the Trails Act, be amended in Section 5. A, in subsection 1, by striking out subject to the regulations, the minister may establish, and substituting the minister may in accordance with subsection 1.1 and the regulations establish. And B, by adding the following immediately after section 1.1, a trail management plan must set out each of the following. A, in relation to each designated trail and designated trail area that is subject to the trail management plan, each of the following. 1, the purpose of and expected benefit from the designated trail or designated trail area. 2, the cultural and historical significance of the designated trail or designated trail area. 3, the designated trails or designated trail area's contribution to each of the following values. A, sustainable outdoor recreation. B, environmental, economic, and social outcomes. C, individual well-being. B, the user experience, landscape conservation, and environmental protection objectives or measures that the minister or the trail manager, as the case may be, must achieve through implementation of the trail management plan and the timeline on which the objectives or measures must be achieved. And C, an explanation as to how the trail management plan complies with any applicable ALSA, that's the Alberta Land Stewardship Act, regional plan. So, Mr. Chair, this amendment is really designed to address some of the gaps that are created in Section 5 of this piece of legislation with respect to trail management plans. Now, anybody can look at the piece of legislation that is before us and see that there really isn't a whole lot of information provided in the legislation about what a trail management plan is to include. And that has created a lot of concern for the people that I've heard from about this legislation, because they want some guardrails. They want to know exactly what, well, not exactly what, but they want to have some kind of idea of what a trail management plan has to include. And I think that's only fair. Mr. Chair, a trail management plan, if it's going to meet the purposes that are established here by going to meet the purposes that the Trails Act is setting out for itself, it has to balance all of these things that are that if this amendment is passed will be set out in a trail management plan. You know, we want to balance the cultural and historical significance. We want to balance sustainable outdoor recreation. We want to balance environmental, economic, and social outcomes, along with individual well-being. I think this is a reasonable request, and certainly one that many of the people that I've talked to have made. You know, it's quite well established that that in some parts of the province we have a density of trails that are creating problems on the landscape. Now it's problems of overuse, problems of environmental damage, and this kind of situation cannot continue in this fashion. It's our hope that by presenting this amendment, that the creation of a trail management plan will seek to be clear about its purposes and how it meets the objectives that are trying to be balanced here. I just want to say a quick note about one section of this bill, or this amendment rather, and that's the cultural and historical significance of designated trail areas. One thing that it's an interesting idea that people who've written to my office about the Trails Act have suggested is that perhaps there are some trails that are so culturally and historically significant here in Alberta that they should be set aside in legislation. And they point to some of the trails in the United States. And I believe one of the examples that was provided to me was the Appalachian Trail in the eastern United States. It runs more or less the length of the country along the Appalachian Mountains. That is set out, designated in legislation, because that trail has such cultural and historical significance to the people of the United States. I certainly hope that as the trail's development process proceeds, we will identify similar trails here in Alberta that have such high cultural and historical importance that they are designated in legislation. That is not the purpose, though, of this amendment. The purpose of this amendment is simply to identify the cultural and historical significance of trails through the designated trail management plans. So, Mr. Chair, let me just sum up by saying that the Trails Act, in its original form, doesn't provide any kind of detail around what a trail management plan should include. This amendment, I think, is designed to address some of those gaps and will put some guardrails in place in the trail management plan creation process that I think will result in the Trails Act being a better piece of legislation and the trail designation and operation process better in terms of balancing all of the various demands on the landscape that we see now. And it's my hope that all members of this Assembly see fit to adopt this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. We are on Amendment A3. Are there any members looking to join debate on Amendment A3? Seeing none. On Amendment A3 as proposed by the Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar, are you agreed? Any opposed? No. That is defeated. We are back on the main bill, Bill 79. Are there any members wishing to join debate on Bill 79? I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's incredibly disappointing to me that the government didn't even see fit to provide a response to Amendment A3. I think that highlights a significant problem that this government is facing. They continue to ignore the voices of Albertans, it's incredibly frustrating, Mr. Chair. The people of Alberta at least want to know what the government's position is on trail management plans, how they'll be created, what they'll contain, and the government provided absolutely no information whatsoever. It boggles the mind, really, to just think that the government sees that this is all fine, that they don't owe the people of Alberta at least a response to these significant concerns that they brought forward. And I know that members here in this chamber right now are getting letters on this very issue. We all certainly have. People have been quite vocal on some of the many gaps that this piece of legislation has created or hasn't addressed. So anyway, we will continue on in the spirit of hope, and to that end, I would like to present another amendment.
Thank you, honourable members. There will be copies of this amendment on the tables. If you would like a copy delivered to you, just put up your hand and one will come to you. This will be Amendment A4 for all those debating, and I see the honourable member for Edmonton Goldbar. If you could please read it into the record, and then if you so choose, you can have obviously more time for remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I move that Bill 79, the Trails Act, be amended in Section 6 by adding the following immediately after Clause 3. 4, the trail manager must provide a report to the minister each year that sets out each of the following. A summary of the signs and notices posted under subsection 2, and B, an explanation as to how these signs and notices support the implementation of the applicable trail management plan. So, Mr. Chair, just to provide a little bit of context on this particular amendment, one of the concerns that we heard from the people of Alberta, who are paying very close attention to the Trails Act and this debate, is that, like Section 5, which just creates a trail management plan, but doesn't actually set out any kind of criteria for what a trail management plan can be, Section 6 is also very silent on what a trail manager, on who a trail manager is, what a trail manager has to do. It doesn't provide any indication, really, about what purpose this person who will be designated the responsible person for a trail management plan will do. Now, in consultation with Parliamentary Council, we tried here as the official opposition to create an amendment as best we could that would at least provide some guardrails, fill in the gaps a little bit about what a trail manager's role will be. And in consultation with Parliamentary Council, we came up with an amendment that says that a trail manager has to provide the summary of signs and notices and explain how those signs and notices support the implementation of the applicable trail management plan. Because it was Parliamentary Council's view that that is the only job that a trail manager has according to this legislation. Now, I suspect that that's probably not what this government had in mind when they created this position of a trail manager through this legislation. I suspect that a trail manager's role will be much more significant than just providing signs and notices under subsection 2. But we really don't know what the trail manager's job is going to be because there are no details in the bill or in any of the public communications that the Environment Department has put out. So this amendment is our best attempt at trying to define the role of a trail manager and provide some accountability to the people of Alberta for the work that a trail manager is doing. Now, I will say that one of the concerns that we have had, we've heard from the people of Alberta with respect to this creation of a trail manager position is that there's no definition, and there's been no intent signaled by the government as to who a trail manager could be. You know, the minister comes from quite a large family. Maybe he intends to appoint many of his other brothers and sisters who aren't in this house as trail managers. I don't know. And that's a significant concern, Mr. Chair. People, I think, rightly expect that the trail manager role will be an important one in making sure that our trails are well constructed and well maintained, and that the Trails Act is meeting the objectives that have been set out for it by the government. But there's no assurance. There's no assurance that the right people are going to be appointed to this role, and that there is no accountability going to be provided when the trail, as the trail managers execute this role. You know, unfortunately, it's not within our power as the official opposition here to amend the bill to put any guardrails around who trail managers are going to be. But certainly one of the things that we've heard from many of the groups is that the trail manager needs to be someone who is knowledgeable about the creation and operation of trails, knowledgeable about the local area, and has a good relationship with many of the stakeholders who are going to be, or who are on the landscape with these trails, and certainly it's my hope that trail managers will at least meet these criteria. One of the other things that we've heard concerns about is we don't know how we don't know what kind of resources trail managers will be given to do this job. There's nothing in the bill that provides any kind of guaranteed revenue stream to a trail manager. Nor is it the case that a trail manager will be an employee of Environment and Parks or any other department of the government. Now, it's quite possible, according to the legislation, that a municipality or the designate of a municipality could be appointed as a trail manager. But municipalities won't be given any revenue, as far as we can tell, from the province to hire somebody to do this role. My fear is that this is another example of the government downloading costs that should be rightly borne by the province onto municipalities. And certainly we know that municipalities vary widely in terms of how well resourced they are to be able to hire a trail manager and give this person the resources that he or she needs to operate a trail management plan. But even more concerning than that, I think, Mr. Chair, is the potential for this trail manager position to be left to volunteers. And I have nothing against volunteers. I think that volunteers have contributed so much to the creation and operation of trail networks here in the province of Alberta, and I'm eager to see that good work continue. You know, the minister continues to hurl assertions at us that we are against partnerships and that we're only looking for union jobs. Let me just first of all say that there's nothing wrong with a union job. In fact, a union job is an excellent way to make sure that you're paid fairly, have excellent benefits, excellent wages and benefits and working conditions that can ensure that you meet your needs, meet your family's needs, be able to take care of your family, put a roof over their head, food on the table, clothes on their back, and shoes on their feet. I don't know why the minister is so concerned that Albertans will have more of these kinds of jobs. Certainly with the high unemployment rate and the rising cost of living, I would think that the minister would be working overtime to figure out how to make sure that more Albertans have these kinds of jobs that pay well, provide good benefits, and have excellent working conditions that ensure that the people who are in those jobs can come home safely at the end of every day. Anyway, that's my rant in support of unionized labor. But one of the things that volunteer groups have identified to us is that they are so strained for capacity that they're not certain if they are able to, that they'll be able to fulfill these roles and meet the objectives that the government has set out for the Trails Act and these trails management plans. I have talked to many trails groups, contrary to the assertions of the government that we haven't. And one of the things that they say is that in order for their volunteers to be successful, they need to have at least some kind of person dedicated to making sure that these trail managers and trail management plans are working suitably. And oftentimes that will require somebody to be paid. And they're not sure who's going to be able to take on this role. One of the things that trails groups are concerned about is that their revenue has dried up. And they don't currently have, because these trails groups operate on donations, almost entirely by donations. They don't have the revenue in place to pay a person to take on these roles. And so if the government wants to appoint these trail managers, I think it makes sense to me to at least provide some resources to enable the proper functioning of these trails management plans. Now, it is my hope, like I said, this amendment doesn't actually amend the legislation to provide those resources to trail managers, but by providing an annual report of the activity of the trail managers, the people of Alberta will at least be able to see what work they've been able to undertake and perhaps get an inkling of what additional resources they need in order to be successful at achieving their objectives. And I think that is something that is sorely lacking. The accountability mechanisms for government departments achieving their objectives are lackluster, shall we say. My friends here in the official opposition and I sit on the Public Accounts Committee, and we get 2 hours a year to question the Environment Department, if we get to question the Environment Department at all. Whether or not they appear before committee is entirely up to the government members, and apparently they're very concerned about other departments. They don't give a whole lot of importance to the Environment Department and making sure that it appears before public accounts. But we have 2 hours to question the Environment Department and how well they've done in achieving their objectives. And let me tell you, Mr. Chair, that there is a lot going on in the Environment Department. We couldn't possibly get through all of the programs and initiatives that the Environment Department has undertaken in a given year and adequately examine them to make sure that the government is achieving the objectives that it's set out to do. So I think this is an additional mechanism that if passed would allow the Environment Department to provide additional accountability and transparency to the people of Alberta. Make sure that trail managers are achieving the objectives that have been set out for them. And if it shows that things are going badly, then the government can respond accordingly and provide them with additional resources. Or perhaps if somebody is failing to meet the objectives because they are not performing their duties well enough, that trail manager can be replaced with somebody else who's better suited to the role. This amendment, if adopted, would make sure that this bill creates a trails management process that is much more likely to be successful, and I think that's really important. I think it's also quite possible that by filing these annual reports, we could identify best practices of trail managers. It's not quite clear to me or to anybody else who's reading this legislation how many trail managers we're going to need to appoint to manage our trails here in the province of Alberta. But with 13,000 kilometers of trails already existing in the province, I think that that's going to require quite a few trail managers. And so if the people of Alberta are able to see these annual reports, we'll be able to look at which trail managers are doing a really good job at meeting the objectives that have been set out for them, and perhaps learn from those best practices and inform other trail managers of best practices as well. I think that this is part of a process of continual improvement that the government should be happy to undertake. So let me just summarize my points as best as I can by saying that this amendment, if passed, will provide sorely needed accountability and transparency on the work that trail managers will be doing in the implementation of this piece of legislation, and will help the government understand how the process is working and be able to respond accordingly with additional resources and plans to improve their work. So it makes sense to me to pass this amendment and make sure that the Trails Act is working as best as it can on behalf of the people of Alberta. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. We are on Amendment A4. I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton South.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to rise and speak to my colleague's Amendment A4 on the Trails Act, Bill 79. And Mr. Chair, let me just begin by saying how profoundly disappointing it is that government members and the government minister cannot even find the time and effort to rise in this place and defend their own legislation or speak to amendments the opposition is proposing. This is a transparency measure that is being proposed right now. This is an accountability measure that's being proposed right now. We're trying to make this legislation better, as is our duty as the official opposition and as elected members in this place. And instead of even bothering to reply, the government appears to be content to vote down amendments without even speaking to their rationale. And Mr. Chair, Albertans aren't really watching, right? We've seen, if you just drive down any street in any area in this province, you'll see protect our park signs. You'll see stop the coal mining signs. You'll see so many different signs that relate to environmental issues that this government has directly caused and is directly responsible for, that is directly responsible for how unpopular this government is as well. And instead of even bothering to stand in this place and defend their legislation and talk about the rationale on amendments we are trying to propose, the government instead sits behind their laptop, sits behind their phones, and does nothing. And Mr. Chair, that is, I think, perhaps a profoundly adequate metaphor for how this government has decided to govern. They've decided to ignore Albertans, just as they're ignoring this House. They decided to ignore the people who sent them here, and instead of actually doing their jobs and debating legislation, and instead of actually doing their jobs and listening to Albertans, they've decided to run away and hide. I think it's profoundly disappointing. I think it's obvious that they're not taking this seriously, that the government is not taking this amendment seriously, they're not taking this bill seriously, they're not taking this job seriously. And I think that's obvious to Albertans as well, and I think that as we move forward with this legislation, we're going to see the same pattern of behavior where the government decides not to engage and not to work on the actual issues that we're being sent here to do work on. And that, I think, is, I think that's, frankly, something that I think would be profoundly seen as laziness by some constituents. If they see their members are not speaking to...
Noted. I see the Honourable Member for Tabor-Warner.
23H, I and J. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member from Edmonton South has said that we are being lazy, that we are running and hiding. Mr. Speaker, if that does not cause some disorder in the House, I'm not sure what will. The Honourable Member was very quick many times in the past to be able to jump up and to call out members of the government House, side of the House, for stating things that he was not happy about. I would ask him to be able to get back to the amendment, which is on the table, and to talk about that rather than encouraging us to be upset about the things that he's saying.
See the honourable member?
This is obviously a matter of debate. I'm referring to what Albertans may perceive, how we're debating this amendment to be. It's certainly something that I think is relevant to debate on this matter. It's a bill that has profound impacts across this entire province, and it's a bill that we have seen has a high level of interest for Albertans. And I'm simply referring to what I think Albertans might see as they watch us today, whether they're watching Assembly online or on their televisions at home. But certainly I've been trying to make the point that this is important legislation. In that context, I think we should continue with debate on that.
Okay, I see the member for Red Deer South with something,
Yes.
I'm assuming it is new to add.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, it is. Mr. Chair, we're occupying our seats. I don't see how we could be running and hiding. This is obviously a false statement.
Okay. I am prepared to rule on this one. I will state that this, by my estimation, doesn't meet the level of a point of order. I think that the language, though perhaps disagreeable to some members of the House, hasn't raised itself to a point where it was absolutely creating disorder. What I would, though, say is that we are on Amendment A4, and I would ask that the honourable member, after having had the opportunity to, I think, say what he wanted to say, I think that it's an opportunity now for us to get back to Amendment A4 specifically.
Thank
Please.
you, Mr. Chair. And certainly, like I was saying, Amendment A4 is simply about accountability, right? It's simply about having a report that a trail manager would provide to the minister and hopefully would be published for Albertans to view. And in a similar way, I think Albertans are interested in seeing what their government is doing, right? They're interested in seeing what trail managers are doing. Albertans are interested in seeing what their government is doing. And Albertans are interested in seeing why their government is choosing not to reply to these amendments and is choosing not to reply and deal with the contents of this bill. And frankly, again, Albertans are watching and they're disappointed. Albertans are here and they're listening. And again, this is an issue that matters to many people, right? This is an issue that you drive around the province and you can see those signs on lawns all over constituencies in Alberta. And with that, Mr. Chair, I strongly recommend, perhaps, that for the government's interest, that they put somebody up to speak against this if they're going to be voting against it. But otherwise, I hope all members would support this, as remaining silent, I think, would mean that you have nothing to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you, honourable member. Are there any members, other members, looking to join on A4? See none. On Amendment A4, as proposed by the honourable member for Edmonton Gold Bar, all those in favour of the amendment, please say aye. Any opposed, please say no. That amendment is defeated. A division has been called. Call on the members. All those in favor of Amendment A4 as proposed by the Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold-Bar, please rise and be counted.
Mr. Dang, Ms. Renault, Member Irwin, Ms. Pancholi, Mr. Nielsen, Ms. Sigurdsson, Mr. Schmidt.
All those opposed to Amendment A4, please rise and be counted.
The Honourable Ms. Schultz, the Honourable Mr. Nixon, the Honourable Mr. Taves, the Honourable Mr. Wilson, the Honourable Mr. Nicolaides, Mr. Long, Mr. Turton, Mr. Amory, the Honourable Ms. Pond, the Honourable Ms. Isaac, Mr. Rutherford, Mr. Scow, the Honourable Mr. Nally, the Honourable Mr. Yassine, the Honourable Ms. Furr, Mr. Van Dyken, Mr. Stephan, Mr. Guthrie, Mr. Jones, Mr. Walker, Mr. Getson, Mr. Smith, Mr. Newdorf, Mrs. Fry, Ms. Rosen, the Honourable Mr. Horner, Mr. Singh, Mr. Hunter, Mrs. Ahir, Mr. Tour.
Mr. Chair, total for the amendment 7, total against 30.
That amendment is defeated. We are back on the main bill, Bill 79. Are there any members wishing to speak? I believe I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold-Bar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It is incredibly concerning to me, as I'm sure it is to the people of Alberta, that at least half of Cabinet can show up to defeat the amendment that I just brought forward.
I just want you to apologize for mentioning whether or not members are...
They just voted. It was a standing vote, Mr. Chair. We all heard their names being called.
In the future, I would just say, please refrain from doing things indirectly that you can't do directly. If the Honourable Member could please continue.
Well, Mr. Chair, as anybody who will go through the transcript will see, half of Cabinet just voted to defeat an amendment, and yet none of them had the decency to even respond to the amendment. That is quite clear from the transcript. More importantly, Mr. Chair, we saw more members of the government caucus engage in points of order than engage in debate. And this is not a one-off. You know, we see that the members are quick to take offense at any perceived slight. And, you know, they take dives all the time. The Italian soccer team...
A point of order has been called. I see
Exactly. This proves my point exactly, Mr. Chair.
I see the Honourable Member for Leduc.
Mr. Chair, thank you. 23BI speaks to a matter other than the question under discussion. I'm not sure what the member from Edmonton Gold-Bar is referring to. Are we on the main bill? Are we on an amendment? He's just a stream of consciousness. Just because he has nothing to say to the bill.
Okay. I will listen to the opposition with regards to a response.
Just had one.
Should there be one? I do not find that this is a point of order. Historically, people do get a wide berth with regards to what they discuss in committee of the whole. I would also just ask that the Honourable Member with the call refer or focus perhaps back onto Bill 79, the Trails Act, and I would not want to be here reflecting on a previous vote of this Assembly. So if the Honourable Member could please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I think it's well within my right to make comments on how this debate has proceeded to this point in my comments regarding the bill and the amendments that I'm going to bring forward. So it is incredibly concerning to me, as well as it is to the people of Alberta, that we've now had 3 members of the UCP caucus stand up and raise points of order for perceived slights, and yet have offered nothing of substance with regard to the amendments that we brought forward. And it is, if the member from Lac St. Anne believes that there is nothing of substance here, then I invite him to tell us why he thinks there's nothing of substance. You know, I understand that the member from Lac St. Anne has troubles distinguishing fish from ducks, but I fully expect him to be able to represent
Interrupt,
the views
however,
of
I
his
am going to ask
constituents
one
in
more
his
time
caucus.
to please, I think what is happening here, and I see what's happening here, is the decorum is slowly but surely beginning to deteriorate. I think in no small part due to both sides of this House and some of the comments that were made. So I would just ask that all members consider the language that they use carefully in order to ensure that it doesn't add to potentially creating disorder within the House, because as we all know, when there's disorder in the House, then there is an effective debate, and we are all here to have effective debates. And at this time, the effective debate that we are having will be on Bill 79, Trails Act. I see the honourable member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me just express my view for the record that it is not both sides who are engaging in lowering the decorum. It is clearly one side that is engaged in trying to derail a good faith debate.
To be clear here, I know you're putting something on the record. Are you challenging my ruling? I ruled that it was seen as debate from both sides and comments from both sides, and you stood up and said, no, that's not true. Is that what you're doing?
Absolutely not, Mr. Chair.
All right, perfect. Just wanted to put that up. If the honourable member could please continue.
So perhaps we will see a change of heart and a change of attitude from the members of the United Conservative Caucus with respect to the final amendment that I intend to bring, that I'll be bringing forward presently.
Referred to as Amendment A5 for all those listening, and of course there will be copies at the tables by the entrances, and if you would like a copy of this Amendment A5, please raise your hand. One will be delivered. If the honourable member for Edmonton Gold Bar could please read it into the record for the benefit of everyone, and then of course please, the option is there to continue with further comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I move that Bill 79, the Trails Act, be amended by adding the following immediately after Section 7. Annual Report on Trail Management Plan, 7.1. The Minister must, within 30 days of the last day of each fiscal year, A, complete a report that sets out the total amount of public monies that the government spent on the implementation of trail management plans during that fiscal year, and B, make the report publicly available. So, Mr. Chair, one thing that has been incredibly concerning to me and to many Albertans who have watched what this government has done with respect to the management of our parks and our public lands has been with respect to transparency around how public money is spent. Now, Mr. Chair, we all know that the government has imposed a number of new user fees on people who are recreating on public land and in parks. We had, at the beginning of the year, the implementation of a random camping fee. Then in the middle of the year, we had the implementation of the Kananaskis Conservation Pass. And we don't know how many additional fees the government may choose to impose in the future because, of course, the government made some amendments to the Public Lands Act that will allow it to increase or create and increase existing fees as it sees fit. Now, one of the promises that the government made when it chose to implement these fees is that we will see a whole host of improvements in the management of our parks and our public lands. They promised to use the money that is collected from the random camping fee as well as the Kananaskis Conservation Pass to hire additional conservation officers, invest in infrastructure improvements. A whole host of things were promised by this government when they implemented the fees. And I hear the member from Banff Kananaskis say that they've delivered on those promises. Well, that's news to the constituents of Banff Kananaskis, because they haven't seen the benefits. They haven't seen where that money has been spent. They certainly don't see the benefit of it. I've heard from many people who have spent the $90 on their Kananaskis Conservation Pass, that all they see are overrun parking lots, overflowing garbage bins, outhouses that aren't being cleaned, trails that aren't being maintained to their expectations. And if they see additional people working as enforcement officers, their only job seems to be to collect the fee that the government has imposed. Now, Mr. Chair, if the government has actually created some kind of benefits that the people of Alberta can see through the creation of these fees and the spending that they've allegedly engaged in these infrastructure improvements and management improvements, then they should absolutely be able to provide an annual report every year outlining in detail where that money has gone. And in fact, when the Public Lands Amendment Act was brought forward in the spring of this year, we brought forward a similar amendment to try to create that kind of transparency and accountability. And the government simply refused. Their response essentially was that we should just take their word for it, that the money is being spent on the things that we say they're being spent on. Please ask us no further questions. Move along. Well, Mr. Chair, the people of Alberta have lost trust and faith in this government. They've already seen that the money collected from the random camping fee and the money collected from the Kananaskis Conservation Pass is not necessarily going to the things that were promised to the people of Alberta when those fees were implemented. And this amendment is designed to address this lack of trust. Now, the government has promised, again, that everybody involved with the creation and management of trails will have all of the resources that it needs to make sure that this is successful. So, prove it. Adopt this amendment. Require annual reports from the Environment Department every year outlining how much money has been spent on trails creation and management, where it's gone, what kind of infrastructure improvements or staff hires have been made to make sure that this Trails Act has been successful. Because without these annual reports, Mr. Chair, there will be no other way for the people of Alberta to see clearly how public money has been spent. I mean, I know that not too many Albertans give their rapt attention to the Environment and Parks Department's annual report. But there is not enough detail in the annual report that will provide people with the assurances that they need that the money that they're already paying for the Kananaskis Conservation Pass, the Random Camping Pass, any support for the Trails Act is going to where it was intended to go. And so, by passing this amendment, I think we are just simply holding the government to its word, to show us their work and make sure that the people of Alberta can clearly understand where the money is going. Now, Mr. Chair, I think this is also sorely needed because one of the things that I've heard from many trails groups, particularly in the Kananaskis area, is that the creation of the Kananaskis Conservation Pass has actually caused donations to their organizations to dry up. I think people rightly assume, because the government has told them, that the $90 a year that they pay to visit Kananaskis is going to be spent on trail improvements. But none of that money seems to be making it to the trails management groups, or not. And I hear the member from Banff Kananaskis taking issue with what I'm saying. And here's the problem. Here's the problem, Mr. Chair, is that if the member from Banff Kananaskis knows how much money is going, we shouldn't have to take her word for it. She's not a member of Executive Council. She's not privy to all of the information that the government has at its fingertips. Only the members of Executive Council have that information, and they should publish it so that everybody has a right to see it. If the member from Banff Kananaskis has special knowledge about how the government is spending its money on trails management, Kananaskis infrastructure improvements and those sorts of things, that's not fair. We should all have access to that information. There should be no question about how much the department is spending and where it's being spent. We shouldn't have to rely on individual MLA's words for it, that the money, that the government is spending certain amounts of money on certain groups. The point that I was trying to make, Mr. Chair, is that the Kananaskis Conservation Pass has actually hit a number of trail groups hard financially. Their donations have dried up. And the grants that the member from Banff Kananaskis says are going to these groups are not filling the gap. These trail groups are being starved for resources, which is not the intent of the government. The government has publicly stated that they want these trail management groups to be successful. Well, they need money to be able to do their work. And if it's not coming from donations, it has to come from somewhere. So at least provide the people of Alberta with, with an annual report. Now, one of the requests that many of the trail management groups had was that a certain portion of government revenue be earmarked for their operations. And I think that that is an interesting idea. However, I just want to make sure that everybody understands that here in the official opposition, we don't have the ability to alter a bill so that it earmarks funding. That would change the nature of this bill to a money bill. We don't have the ability as the official opposition to make those changes. So that's one of the reasons that we aren't moving forward with something that would actually guarantee a steady stream of revenue to trails groups to make sure that they're successful in achieving the objectives that the government has set out for them. But I think that this is the best that we can do as the official opposition, and making sure that there is public money going to their operations, and that the people of Alberta can see where it's well spent. So I encourage all members of the government, as well as my friends in the official opposition, to actually show that they're doing what they say they would do and pass this amendment and provide the people of Alberta with the information that is currently sorely lacking. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I see the honourable member for Tabor-Warner.
Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair, I would like to just speak to this really quickly and state that the member knows full well, as he was part of Executive Council in the last iteration of their government, and knows that when bills are passed through legislation, there are also other parts to it, which is regulations and policies and forms. And the member knows full well that all of the amendments that he has brought forward could be done very easily within regulations and policies. And this strategy that he is employing now, Mr. Chair, and to the members' in the chamber, you need to realize that this is a stall tactic. This is exactly what he's doing. This is a very good bill. I believe that all members need to see this as prescriptive versus working towards making this a better bill. And I would ask all members to vote it down.
Next, I see the honourable member for Edmonton Decor.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be very, very brief. Obviously, I rise in support of the amendment. And I actually expect there's a few, members of the UCP that should be voting in support of this amendment. Because just yesterday afternoon, Mr. Chair, we spoke about a private member's bill that talks exactly about doing this, about being transparent, about teaching Albertans where their money is being spent. And several members got up and almost sung the praises for the member for Red Deer South for bringing his bill forward. And so if that is indeed the case, if that is actually what you believe, then you would support this amendment, because that is the exact same principle. So we're going to find out, Mr. Chair, whether that's indeed a fact, but I thought I'd better point that out to some of those members, that if they do vote against this, I'm expecting them then to vote against the private member's bill, because that does the exact same thing.
Thank you, honourable member. We are on Amendment A5. Seeing none, I see the honourable member for Chestermere Strathmore.
Thank you. I'm just going to take 10 seconds. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to respond a little bit to what the member had said. But they voted against that motion yesterday by the member of Red Deer South, so I find it interesting that that should be brought up, considering it's exactly what we think, and that he would have mentioned that, how important that was, but he actually voted against the bill. Thank you.
All right. Any other members on Amendment A5? Seeing none on Amendment A5 as proposed by the honourable member for Edmonton Gold Bar. All those in favour of Amendment A5, please say aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. That is defeated. A division has been called. Ring the bells. Thank you, honorable members. A division has been called on Amendment A5. All those in favor of Amendment A5, please rise and be counted.
Mr. Dang, Ms. Renault, Member Irwin, Ms. Pancholi, Mr. Nielsen, Ms. Sigurdsson, Mr. Schmidt.
All those opposed to A5, please rise and be counted.
The Honorable Mr. Panda, the Honorable Ms. Schultz, the Honorable Mr. Nixon, the Honorable Mr. Taves, the Honorable Mr. Wilson, the Honorable Mr. Nicolaides, Mr. Long, Mr. Turton, Mr. Amory, the Honorable Ms. Pond, the Honorable Ms. Isaac, Mr. Rutherford, Mr. Scow, the Honorable Mr. Nally, the Honorable Mr. Yassine, the Honorable Ms. Furr, Mr. Van Dyken, Mr. Guthrie, Mr. Jones, Mr. Smith, Mr. Walker, Mr. Getson, Mr. Steffen, Mr. Newdorf, Mrs. Fry, Ms. Rosen, the Honorable Mr. Horner, Mr. Singh, Mr. Hunter, Mrs. Ahir, Mr. Tour.
Mr. Chair, total for the amendment 7, total against 31.
That amendment is defeated. We are back on the main bill, Bill 79. Are there any members looking to join debate? Seeing none. Are you ready for the question on Bill 79, Trails Act? On the clauses of the bill, are you agreed? Agreed. Any opposed? No. Carried. On the title and the preamble, are you agreed? Agreed. Any opposed? No. Carried. Shall the bill be reported? Are you agreed? Agreed. Any opposed? No. Carried. The committee now has Bill 80 before it. I'll allow people just some time. We'll have 80 in 30 seconds or less.
A1.
Thank you, honorable members. The committee now has before it Bill 80, Red Tape Reduction Implementation Act 2021. Are there any comments or questions to be offered with respect to this bill? We are on Amendment A1. I see the honorable member for St. Albert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise and speak to Amendment A1 for Bill 80, Red Tape Reduction Implementation Act 2021. And basically, what this amendment looks to do, or tries to do, is to remove Section 10 in the bill that pertains to income support. And I think, I've spoken to this bill a couple of times already. I think that I have focused, every time that I've talked about this, I've focused on this particular piece because I think it is one of the most problematic pieces in this piece of legislation. And I would hope that all members, regardless of which side of the House you currently sit on, I would hope that they would listen to the concerns and understand that voting for this piece of legislation has the potential to negatively impact thousands of Albertans' lives, and I'd like to explain how it does that. So what income support, for those of you that don't know, income support is very much like assured income. Assured income is a form of income support, but the eligibility criteria is very specific around severity and permanence of disability. Income support is a little bit different, and the amounts that people get on income support are less than half of what people receive on AISH. So people on income support, there are two categories. There are expected to work, and there's barriers for employment. So people that are on barriers for employment, income support, typically have chronic health conditions, mental health issues. Often they have disabilities. They're either in the process of applying for AISH, they've been turned down, they're appealing. So there are really significant barriers to their employment, and that's been demonstrated usually over a period of many years. The expected to work category is quite different. So this is a group of Albertans that have a lot of challenges in terms of maintaining competitive employment for whatever reason. They are very low income. These are people with very few assets. In fact, I think the eligibility to qualify for expected to work income support is that maximum assets you can have, I think, are about $5,000 in RSPs, and total value of a vehicle, which is can't exceed about $10,000. And the amount that you earn or have earned cannot exceed the core benefits of income support. Now, what you need to know is that income supports for an expected to work person who's eligible is $745. Now, can you imagine trying to live, and that's for a single person, it's a little bit more if you have children, but can you imagine trying to navigate life on $745 a month? It's impossible, Mr. Speaker, and I would challenge any member of this House to find someone who could tell you that living on income support is manageable and comfortable, because it most definitely is not. So what this piece of, basically what this change in this piece of legislation does is, before this was proposed, income support benefits were legislated. So basically, if you met the criteria for income support in terms of your eligibility, you're over 18 years old, a resident of Alberta, all of these things, if your income and your financial assets met the threshold for eligibility, you were eligible for income support. That's it. You were eligible. This was a legislated benefit. What this legislation does or proposes to do is to remove that and to put it into, first of all, into advanced education, but into regulation. So it no longer is you must receive these benefits or you will receive these benefits if you are eligible. It's you may receive these benefits if there are funds available to you. And in particular for this piece of legislation, those are federal benefits. So of course, none of us can guarantee that those benefits will be available to people. So the really sad thing about this, Mr. Speaker, the really sad part about this is the short-sightedness. I think this government, we've come to know that this government, if they are anything at all, it is short-sighted. They cannot see that even if it's only a few thousand Albertans that are impacted by this change, by removing the support for people, they're introducing more long-term problems, long-term poverty, long-term unemployment, not just for the person who is impacted by the change, but their families, the people that they're supporting. And it is really just a ridiculous change, in my opinion. I think, once again, this is evidence of the short-sightedness of this government simply trying to cut costs to make their deficit look better in any given fiscal year without thinking, what is the long-term impact on Albertans? I don't believe this is a government that looks at and measures the benefit to Albertans when they make these decisions. They crow about it a lot, Mr. Chair. They talk about, we're going to do it for Albertans, we're listening to Albertans, we're here for them. But then what they say and what they do don't match. If they did match, Mr. Chair, I have no doubt that this government would not be voting for this piece of legislation. I also want to put on the record a second time is that I'm stunned at the cowardice, the true cowardice of this government for them to make huge changes to income support benefits like assured income for the severely handicapped, like income support for expected to work, that they make these really big changes via a piece of legislation that they call red tape reduction, which is really just an omnibus bill. They claim, oh no, we're just cleaning things up, we're making it better, it's going to be easier for people. But that is just patently false. So the cowardice of this government to make these really deep changes to income support benefits in a bill like this is just awful. It's just awful. It's a symbol of how little care and concern this government has demonstrated from day one for people who are disabled, for people who are low income. It's truly sad. You know, I look back at the 2.5, I guess almost 2.5 years under this government, and they have chipped away at benefits like this for people that, first of all, rarely have a voice in this place, that do not have a lot of power, that do not have a lot of influence. They don't have lobbyists working for them, that is for sure. And this government has chipped away at programs and supports for people who are vulnerable, and this is just one more example of that. So I wanted to talk about in section 10. So this amendment looks to eliminate section 10 of Bill 80. So the Employment and Income Supports Act was amended in this legislation by phasing out part-time and full-time learners on income support as of April 1st, 2022. Now, the UCP claims that this will be replaced under regulation in advanced education. And in fact, a couple of weeks ago, we heard the Minister for Advanced Education say this very thing. A number of my colleagues stood up that day and then subsequent days that we were debating this legislation and asked very pointed questions. If that is the case, if it's simply a transfer because this government sees fit to move this adult learner program to advanced education, then tell us, what is the rationale? Who asked for it? Were there bureaucrats that suggested to this government that this would make things more seamless, easier, cost savings? Did low-income Albertans talk to this government and say, hey, why don't you move this to advanced education because it'll make our lives easier? I don't think so. This is a government that has time and again failed to consult with Albertans on changes that actually impact their lives. We see it time and again, whether it's around housing, whether it's around income supports for disabled Albertans, whether it's around coal mining, whatever it is, this government fails to consult. But the reality is that these small changes, you know, the government members opposite seem thoroughly bored with my comments, but these small changes that are made in Bill 80 have the ability to really negatively impact individual families, and they may be your constituents. But yet there seems to be no thought whatsoever by this government, by the members opposite, to think, well, maybe we got it wrong. Or at the very least, ask your own minister, ask the minister, if it's just a simple transaction, moving this pot of money from community and social services to advanced education, and really it's not going to impact anything at all, then how much money, what are we talking about? What is the budget? What is the advantage of doing that? How does it make life better for anybody? Because this government has failed to answer any of these questions. So of course, Mr. Chair, we're left wondering, why on earth are you doing this? And then I default to my reason that this government seems to prove over and over again is their reason, is just to make the bottom line look a little different. That's all. You know, perfect example is, it was over a year ago, with almost no notice whatsoever, none. This government changed payment dates for approximately 130,000 Albertans. Now, these are people who live, most of them, in poverty. They earn less than any kind of poverty line you want to establish. Those are people on AISH and people on income support. This government chose to change the payment date not to make life better, like they said, which was not true. We had to go to the Auditor General to prove that, but it was not true. They did it to make their bottom line temporarily look better by changing a payment date. We know this. This is fact. This is proven by the Auditor General. This was just to make the bottom line look better, and there was no consultation with actual human beings, Albertans, who would be impacted by this, who incurred NSF charges, who were faced with eviction, who couldn't pay their bills, who had to stretch very meager funds just a few more days. So one more example of this government making life just a little bit harder for Albertans. So going back to this amendment, you know, I would hope, I've said this again and again, no government ever gets it 100% right. I think we could probably all agree on that. Nobody is perfect. Everybody makes mistakes. I would suggest that this government really rethink this and at least think about this amendment. if you're so dead set about passing this piece of legislation, that's fine. You have the numbers right now to do that, that is fine. But I implore you to think about the decision that you're making for this small segment of people in Alberta that rely on this support. They rely on income support, and they rely on the training amount to change their lives. They rely on it. And the way that it is right now, it's not perfect, but the system, the way that it is right now, ensures that anybody who is eligible gets it. The changes that this government is proposing alters that. And so it puts in some criteria that the federal dollars be available. And who knows what else, because we don't know. We have not seen the regulations. And for the least trusted government in this country to say, well, trust us, we'll just work it out in regulations, no problem. You know what? There is not a lot of faith. Albertans don't trust this government. I certainly don't. So one of the other things, we've seen time and time again, this government is just unwilling to make changes in the sunlight, to debate the real issues, or to answer difficult questions where we all can see, understand, and then fact check. Instead, they make sweeping changes and then push them aside and make the details, and the devil is in the details, and then they make these changes through regulation, and then there is nothing we can do about that once that's done. So, Mr. Chair, it is incredibly disappointing that at this late hour, here we are talking about yet another change that will harm people. And I just want to remind the members in this place, you may not care, but Albertans certainly care, and Albertans that are struggling, and there are a lot of them. Albertans that are struggling have felt the impact of really bad decisions made by this government. And I'm talking about really, really vulnerable people. So people who are on income support, I can pretty much guarantee you they do not want to be on income support. They are very likely at probably the worst time in their lives. For whatever reason, things have happened and things are not going well, where they are forced to go on income support. They don't have any choice. Now, there is this program that allows them to make use of a learner program to possibly change their skills, learn new skills, enhance some skills, so that they can be ready for employment and change their lives going forward. And the way that the legislation is now, it guarantees that if they are eligible, they will get that help. The change that this government is proposing takes that away. And are you all okay with that? Are you okay with that? Knowing what this legislation does, are you comfortable with that? Because what may change your bottom line right now, I suspect that is why this is happening, but what may change the bottom line right now has the ability to, let's put it in dollars and cents, has the ability to cost a whole lot more in the future. So if we don't invest in people today, it will cost us far more in the future. I can recall, Mr. Chair, the first time I saw, or the first budget that I saw at this government table was, I was horrified at the cuts to income support. I was horrified. There were tens of millions of dollars cut, so of course you know that in the budget they're projecting the next few years what the budget will look like. And we saw very clearly what the intent was of this government. So over the next few years, there were massive, massive cuts to income support. Actually, budget 2021 was $83 million alone. So we saw right in 2019, we saw what the goal was of this government, and that was to cut deep, deep cuts to income support. Now, don't forget, these are really vulnerable people. There's about it's about 45,000 now during COVID. But these are tens of thousands of Albertans that are quite vulnerable. They're vulnerable financially and otherwise. So this is a government that has had a plan all along to cut income supports, and we've seen more and more evidence of that. This is just the latest. We saw payment date changes. We saw the index change, the de-indexation. Now, I always find it almost insulting, actually, to Alberta. I'm used to it, but I think Albertans find it insulting, is that when we say, you cut income support benefits, you cut AISH benefits, and the government, I guess the government brain trust came up with the spin, we didn't cut. Well, you de-indexed. So 2 years later, it's a massive cut. So what they did in 2019, and let's be clear, a lot of members sitting in here right now, this morning, voted in support of indexing these benefits. And said again and again and again in local papers to their constituents, oh, no, don't we support this? Trust us. We would never do anything to harm. The now premier, at the time, he was all over the media accusing NDP of fear-mongering, fear and smear, because we were saying that we anticipated this would be one of the things that this government would do. And sure enough, Mr. Chair, that was one of the first things they did via omnibus bill. Why? I would say cowardice.
Yeah.
So this is a government that, it's beyond disappointing at this point, but that has continued to make life incredibly difficult by cutting income support. We saw right off the bat what the plan was, and we've seen it happen ever since. We've seen de-indexation. And by the way, 2 years after you de-indexed and cut Asian income support benefits, people on Asian income support earn approximately $1,300 less per year now than they would have had you just left things alone. Now, what's really funny to me is that people will crow, well, your federal counterparts, making this their new poster, I guess, is to crow about inflation and try to blame whoever. But talking about inflation, we know inflation is real. We see it. You can't ignore how much it costs you when you buy your groceries. We know this is a fact. Inflation is real. And this government has taken away any capacity for Albertans who are incredibly vulnerable, whether it's financially vulnerable or vulnerable via disability. They've taken away any ability that they had or have to manage inflation, to even try to keep their head above water. And yet this government will claim making life better for Albertans. Well, I would suggest that their plan is to make life better for some Albertans.
That's right.
Only some. Because it seems like only some are worth this government's support. It is certainly not vulnerable Albertans. So, Mr. Chair, I would really encourage, I'm hopeful, I'm always hopeful that things can change. I am hopeful that there are some members, some government members that realize that the people that tell them what to do or tell them the way things are aren't always right. They don't always have all the answers. They certainly don't have a crystal ball to the future. They're just not always right. It is my sincere hope that there are some government members that are actually paying attention, have a little bit of humility, and maybe think, well, you know what, maybe we got this little piece wrong.
Thank you. I see the honourable member for Edmonton Decor on Amendment A1.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Happy to rise. Just add some very brief comments here to Amendment A1 and the reason why I feel we need to pull out this section out of the bill. I want to thank my friend from St. Albert for very clearly explaining the impacts this is going to have on the very real people that the government purports to represent. It almost seems a little bit like, why are we putting this section in a red tape bill to begin with the implications of it? Because it really seems a little bit like it's this attitude of penny wise but pound foolish. Okay, so here you are asking some of the most vulnerable Albertans, like my friend from St. Albert has said, yet we seem to have had money to give a $4.7 billion corporate handout. We seem to have had a whole bunch of money, millions, tens of millions of dollars to go and chase Bigfoot and not even design a logo properly. We spend millions of dollars on a report to find out that there was nothing going on. Yet we're asking these individuals to take the hit for that. And I know the argument that I've heard, this is going to be covered off in another area. Titled the Foundational Assistance Learning Program, which in Section 3 the minister only needs to fund the program if it has money. So as long as we continue to make decisions like, oh, I don't know, betting $1.3 billion on an election, well, we're not going to have any money. If we're going to continue to make decisions like $4.7 billion corporate handouts, we're not going to have any money. That is the problem here. And one of the other concerns that I have that I really want to emphasize to MLAs that they pay attention to here, because in Section 6 outlines that the minister gets a lot of discretion on what type of funding is approved and who it applies to. You know, I remember the former minister for red tape reduction, when he served very well in the official opposition in the 29th legislature, was ridiculously opposed to giving a minister that type of leeway. And so it should be no surprise that I have that kind of problem. And then the other problem I have, of course, in Section 8, stating that the minister determines the amount each student can receive. That really leaves it up to just a willy-nilly decision on things. And I am sure that members of the government caucus who served in that 29th legislature would not have let that go quietly. And yet, now that roles are reversed, are you prepared to let it go quietly? It's kind of seeming like that. I might be surprised. Never presupposed the decision of the House. But again, it's funny how it always comes down to what has been said before and what's being said now. And the two are always butting heads, persistently and consistently. So I am really urging that members of this House support this amendment to pull this out. We need to just put the brakes on this and not leave it on the backs of the people that can least afford it. Trust me, the Walton family can afford something a little bit more.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Are there any members wishing to join on Amendment A1? Seeing none, on Amendment A1 as proposed by the Honourable Member for Lethbridge West on behalf of the Honourable Member for Edmonton Decore, all those in favour of Amendment A1, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. That amendment, I believe the noes have it, but a division has been called. Ring the bells. members, a division has been called on Amendment A1. All those in favor of Amendment A1, please rise and be counted.
Mr. Dang, Ms. Renault, Member Irwin, Ms. Pancholi, Mr. Nielsen, Ms. Sigurdsson, Mr. Schmidt.
All those opposed to Amendment A1, please rise and be counted.
The Honourable Mr. Nixon, the Honourable Mr. Panda, the Honourable Ms. Schultz, the Honourable Mr. Wilson, the Honourable Mr. Nicolaides, Mr. Long, Mr. Turton, Mr. Amory, the Honourable Ms. Isaac, Mr. Rutherford, Mr. Scow, the Honourable Mr. Yassine, the Honourable Ms. Furr, Mr. Van Dyken, the Honourable Ms. Pond, Mr. Guthrie, Mr. Jones, Mr. Smith, Mr. Walker, Mr. Getson, Mr. Steffen, Mr. Newdorf, Mrs. Fry, Ms. Rosen, the Honourable Mr. Horner, Mr. Singh, Mr. Hunter, Mrs. Ahir, Mr. Tour.
Mr. Chair, total for the amendment 7, total against 29.
Thank you, honourable members. That amendment is defeated. We are back on the main bill, Bill 80. I see the Honourable Minister of Red Tape Reduction has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At this time, I wish to move an amendment.
There will be copies at the tables of this amendment by the entrances. You can also raise your hand and one will be delivered to you. For the benefit of all, this will be Amendment A2. If the Honourable Minister could continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The amendment is required simply due to a numbering error in Section 5. These amendments make no changes to the content of Bill 80 and are simply a renumbering exercise to ensure there is not any duplicative numbering in the Ensuring Fiscal Sustainability Act, which then subsequently amends the Alberta Healthcare Insurance Act.
Thank you, honourable members. We are on A2. I see the honourable member for Edmonton Decor.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will actually thank the Associate Minister for Red Tape for sharing this a little bit earlier, so we were able to take a little bit of a peek at it. And while I don't necessarily have any problems with the amendment, I would be remiss in my job if I didn't point out that we quite honestly shouldn't even be here to begin with. So one of the things that the official opposition tried to very, very clearly point out that the proposed legislation around essentially telling doctors where they're going to work in the province of Alberta was going to go over like a lead balloon. We've seen how that type of legislation clearly failed in, I believe it was Nova Scotia, where they brought that in. They're in the process, if they've not already completed the process, to get rid of that directive, telling their doctors where they're going to work. Because at the end of the day, they're kind of like small business owners. Can you imagine if small business owners were told, well, no, you're going to set up your shop down the block here in this one location that's maybe not quite as desirable than the one that you are currently looking at. I mean, those business owners would be absolutely furious. Doctors are kind of the same way. So you might have an individual that grew up in rural Alberta and wants to practice medicine and then come back to their hometown to do that practice, but you're all of a sudden going to tell them, no, I'm sorry, I realize you live up north here somewhere, but you're going to be practicing down in Calgary. And that's just going to spectacularly fail. So we shouldn't have even been here to begin with, Mr. Chair, and we tried to warn the government that that type of change was going to be not in their best favor. But I am, of course, pleased that at least the government realized, based on the language that we saw here in Bill 80, to maybe push pause and consult a little bit further. My guess is that likely, because I've certainly heard from doctors, that they probably got an earful on it. And so, you know, I think the last thing they need is yet another bad news story. And so at least they're working on trying to maybe fix that. I would suggest that you probably just repeal it. As I said, we've already seen one example where it spectacularly failed. They're in the process of repealing, if not have repealed it. So just learn from that example. Just abandon that. And while I still have significant concerns currently with Bill 80 and some of the contents, especially since we just voted down an amendment to get rid of a very, very problematic section of the bill. I'm happy to support the current amendment. You know, will that change my entire outlook of Bill 80? Likely not, because, again, we're putting together legislation that has things that we're trying to call red tape, which is really just housekeeping. It could have been taken care of through a Statutes Amendment Act. But actually, now that I think of it, you know, we haven't actually heard an answer yet from any of the ministers, especially the health minister, of whether the cut and paste job of the healthcare premiums into the Healthcare Act is not a precursor to bringing in healthcare premiums. No one has actually stood in this House and said, no, that's not the case. So hopefully we've still got some time here left in Committee of the Whole that we could get somebody to jump up and put Albertans' minds at ease, because I'm getting those questions still. Is there healthcare premiums? And, you know, I would almost say if that was indeed the case, as long as the money is actually going to go into healthcare, maybe Albertans will agree. I don't know. But if it's just going to go into general revenues to be then funneled into organizations that, as I've mentioned earlier this morning, chase Bigfoot or, you know, are going after environmentalists for doing what they're allowed to legally do and things like that, then I think Albertans are going to have a problem with that. But that's probably a discussion for another time. So I will urge all members to support the current amendment. But, you know, overall, would I be supporting the bill? Likely not, because I have some very, very significant problems with one section of the bill that clearly puts the most vulnerable Albertans in an even worse place, and they can't afford that right now.
Thank you, Honourable Member. We are on A2. Any members wishing to join? Seeing none. On Amendment A2 is proposed by the Honourable Associate Minister of Red Tape Reduction. All those in favour, please say aye. Any opposed, please say no. Carried. We are back on the main bill, Bill 80, Red Tape Reduction. Are there any members wishing to join debate on Bill 80? Seeing none. Are you ready for the question on Bill 80, Red Tape Reduction Implementation Act 2021, number 2? On the clauses of the bill, are you agreed? Any opposed? No. Carried. On the title and a division has been called on the question. Call in the members. Thank you, honourable members. A division has been called on the clauses of Bill 80, Red Tape Reduction Implementation Amendment Act 2021, number 2. All those in favour of the clauses, please rise and be counted.
The Honourable Mr. Panda, the Honourable Ms. Schultz, the Honourable Mr. Nixon, the Honourable Mr. Taves, Mr. Long, Mr. Churton, Mr. Amory, Mr. Stephan, the Honourable Ms. Isaac, Mr. Rutherford, Mr. Scow, the Honourable Mr. Nally, the Honourable Mr. Yassine, the Honourable Ms. Furr, Mr. Van Dyken, the Honourable Ms. Pond, the Honourable Mr. Nicolaides, Mr. Guthrie, Mr. Jones, Mr. Smith, Mr. Walker, Mr. Getson, Mr. Newdorf, Mrs. Fry, Ms. Rosen, the Honourable Mr. Horner, Mr. Singh, Mr. Hunter, Mrs. Ahir, Mr. Chor.
All those opposed to the clauses, please rise and be counted.
Mr. Dang, Ms. Renault, Member Irwin, Ms. Pancholi, Mr. Nielsen, Ms. Sigurdsson, Mr. Schmidt.
Mr. Chair, total for the remaining clauses 30, total opposed 7.
And that is carried. On the title and preamble, are you agreed? Any opposed? Carried. Shall the bill be reported? Are you agreed? Any opposed? Carried. And a division has been called. Call in the members. Thank you, honourable members. A division has been called on whether the bill should be reported. All those in favour of reporting Bill 80, please rise and be counted.
The Honourable Mr. Panda, the Honorable Ms. Schultz, the Honorable Mr. Nixon, the Honorable Mr. Taves, Mr. Long, Mr. Churton, Mr. Amory, Mr. Stephan, the Honorable Ms. Isaac, Mr. Rutherford, Mr. Scow, the Honorable Mr. Nally, the Honorable Mr. Yassine, the Honorable Ms. Furr, Mr. Van Dyken, the Honorable Ms. Pond, the Honorable Mr. Nicolaides, Mr. Guthrie, Mr. Jones, Mr. Smith, Mr. Walker, Mr. Getson, Mr. Newdorf, Mrs. Fry, Ms. Rosen, the Honorable Mr. Horner, Mr. Singh, Mr. Hunter, Mrs. Ahir, Mr. Chor.
All those opposed, please rise and be counted.
Ready? Mr. Dang, Ms. Renault, Member Irwin, Ms. Pancholi, Mr. Nielsen, Ms. Sigurdsson, Mr. Schmidt.
Mr. Chair, total in favor 29, total against 7.
That is carried and so ordered. Seeing the time and understanding order 4 sub 3, the committee will now rise and report bills 79 and 80 with amendments. Order. I see the honourable member for Calgary East.
Speaker, the Committee of Whole has had under consideration certain bills. The committee reports the following bills. Bill 79, the committee reports the following bill with some amendments. Bill 80. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table copies of all amendments considered by Committee of the Whole on this day of the official records of the Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, honourable member. Does the Assembly concur in the report? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. That is carried and so ordered. And noting the time, it is noon. Understanding order 4 sub 2.1. The Assembly stands adjourned until 1:30 p.m. today.